Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I know this is a big room for this gathering, but we had some other things going on in some other rooms, so this was the best spot. But we really appreciate you being here. Hopefully, you're enjoying History Weekend. Hopefully, you were able to make the ball last night and had a lot of fun. I heard good reports about that. So we're going to talk this morning about the bunker, and we don't want to give you a bunker tour because I know probably all of you have had that. So, but we wanted to go a little more in depth of the reason for the bunker, how it ended up here, some of Dr. Bob's personal stories of his time dealing with the bunker, and really kind of go in depth with some of that. And we want this to be a question and answer type flowing session. So we encourage you to ask questions if you have them. I think the easiest way to do it is as we go through, as we're talking about a specific topic. If you have a question on that topic, go ahead and raise your hand and we'll address it then. And then at the end of the presentation, if there's anything that we haven't talked about that you want to know, feel free to ask that as well. Dr. Bob knows it all, so any question you have, it doesn't even have to be about the Greenbrier, it can be about anything. He knows it all. So, yeah.
And if I don't know it, Betsy is here.
But if any of you don't know, this is Dr. Bob Conte. He was our historian for 42 years, is that right?
43.
43 years, and retired in 2022, but he is now our Historian Emeritus, and he's done a good job so far this weekend, so I guess we're going to let him keep that title for a little while. But,
that's a nice title, I like that.
It makes you sound fancy.
It goes with the beard.
You have Doctor and Emeritus, that's quite impressive. But so we'll go ahead and get started on this and kind of tell you a little bit of the story. So we're going to start in 1913 with the building of the hotel, because obviously you can't have a bunker at the Greenbrier if there is no Greenbrier. So that's where we're going to start. And Dr. Bob, I know there was probably lots of reasons that the Grand Central Hotel, which was built in 1858, no longer served its purpose, and the Greenbrier needed to be born. But just get into that story a little bit about why the Greenbrier was built.
You know, I always sort of say there's almost like two histories of the Greenbrier. You know, there's this old 19th century history, and the dividing line is February 1st, 1910 to be exact, which is the day that the railroad across the street, the then Chesapeake and Ohio Railway, bought the property. And they bought it because everybody was coming here on their trains. That was one of the key things to why the Greenbrier is still here. In fact, I think probably the most important thing that ever happened in the history of the Greenbrier in terms of its survival is they built the railroad right across the street, right after the Civil War. And so by the early 20th century, the railroad is booming. The railroad was built, the C&O, which, as you might guess, connected to Chesapeake Bay and the Ohio River. So it connected sort of the Virginia Beach, Norfolk area, originally to Huntington, and then they built it to Cincinnati, and eventually through purchases and mergers, they got all the way to Chicago. So they were pretty much extended, from one end of the country all the way to the Midwest to Chicago, and coal was booming. I mean, that's what the C&O is all about. And they built this railroad right through the middle of some of the most productive coal fields in America. So the point is they're very prosperous. So they buy this property, which, by the early 20th century was starting to fade. The old hotel, had seen better days. And this was a summer-only resort at that point, so that's part of this whole dividing. So when the railroad buys the property, they decide to do some serious upgrading. So they built the Greenbrier that you see here, which was just a central part of today's building. The original Greenbrier was considerably smaller, maybe half the size of, it's going to get a major expansion in 1930. And so it opens as a year-round operation. So October 1st, 1913 was the official day of opening the Greenbrier. And they had a golf course. That's the critical things that are done right there when the railroad buys it is build the Greenbrier on this end in 1913, and then the old white golf course opens in 1914.
And then I guess even before the Greenbrier was the Bath Wing, right?
Right, yeah, actually, the first project was the bathroom. Yeah, I always think one of the great features of Greenbrier is that indoor swimming pool, which was built in 1912, you know. Still has all the original tile in the indoor pool. So really, yeah, they had, and they used to advertise that the tagline was a European cure in America, and that's because what they were really the pitch was the spa. You know, this was the most up-to-date spa in the country. The pool and the two upper floors back in the original days, which are now all offices. You know, since we built the new spa, you know, that was the spa. So yeah, that were really put. And it's a funny idea. I think golf was sort of seen as a healthy thing to do, right, as opposed to a thing that existed because of itself, you know, for its own purposes. You know, since you're coming here to improve your health, one of the things you can do to improve your health is get some fresh air out there on the golf course.
I guess a question I've really never understood, I had the answer to, is so when it's built in 1913, the Grand Central is still standing and still. Did they? If you came during the summertime, could you stay in either one? Or
right. Yeah, that's in hindsight. Why didn't they just build it? It's one of those. I don't know. You know, I've certainly wondered myself. Again, by that point, remember the place had been here 100 years, and you know, people don't really like change. I mean, I remember reading this prominent Richmond family, the Valentine family, you know, when the Greenbrier opened, Mr. Valentine refused to go in the hotel. The old white was good enough for Granddaddy, it's good enough for me. And so I'm only staying in the old white. I'm not going in that new fancy sort of New York hotel, you know. And I think those old Southerners said, we're not going over there. We're staying where Granddaddy stayed here. So yeah, it was a funny situation. You had 9 years. We had 2 hotels, 1913 to 1922. And right, so if you came here in the summer, you could stay at Old White.
And between the two of them, how many rooms are we talking at that point?
Probably what?
How many rooms are there?
Actually, they probably had about the same number of rooms. I think the original Greenbrier had 250, and Old White may have had like 225, something like that. And again, it was a summer-only hotel. I get the sense that it really was sort of going downhill there. In fact, I read somewhere where they were doing they had this gigantic main dining room, and they were doing golf practice, you know, in the dining room with the Old White by 1920, 1921. So, you know, I think it's seen better day. I know for years and years, I think maybe we still say it couldn't pass the fire inspection code. I have a feeling we paid the inspector. could you condemn this place? And I think what actually happened was maybe the railroad assumed that you're going to maintain that summer clientele, and of course to some degree they did. But what happened is the Greenbrier became sort of a midway spot between Palm Beach and Newport, Rhode Island. And all this, maybe they didn't anticipate this, all of a sudden this became very popular in the spring and autumn. So back in the day, we all had a home in Palm Beach, right? And then, and we had a summer and a winter home, and we had a summer home in Newport, Rhode Island. And so everybody would spend their winters in Palm Beach, get on the train, and then they'd stop at Pinehurst, you know, and kind of as they were going north in the spring, and then you spent your summer in Newport, and then you stopped at the Greenbrier. I think that was probably the big surprise that this whole spring and autumn business started.
Okay.
Incidentally, as you might imagine, they would, if there was overflow, I've heard stories, they would try and put people in the Old White. Well, you know, if you've been here in April, it can get a little chilly, you know. You don't want to be in a hotel that doesn't have any heat in April, I can assure you.
Absolutely. So the slideshow here skips a few years, but I do want to touch on something that you mentioned a minute ago, which is the expansion, which really changed the Greenbrier in 1930. And just talk a little bit about what all was involved with that.
Well, you know, I think essentially the Greenbrier just did way better than they ever thought, you know. And in that period, in the 20s, the railroad was taken over by a group in Cleveland. These two brothers, the Van Swearingen brothers. And the Van Swearingen brothers are legends in Cleveland. They built Terminal Tower. If you've ever been to Cleveland, they built Terminal Tower. They developed Shaker Heights, if you're familiar with one of the all-time incredible planned residential areas. And the story is, and I think this is apocryphal, that they needed a railroad to connect Shaker Heights, which is out on the eastern part of town, to downtown. And so they bought a railroad that ran from Buffalo to Cleveland. I think that's sort of overstated, oversimplified, but they got into the railroad business, and they bought the C&O. So they were upgrading the rail lines along here. They started 2 new passenger trains, the Sportsman, which went from Detroit to Virginia Beach, to Norfolk in 1930, and then shortly after that, they started another train, back when trains had names, you know, the George Washington, that went from Washington to Chicago. So a lot more people were literally going by across the street. I think that's part of the thinking that they needed a bigger hotel. Also, one of the things that developed in the 1920s is group business, conferences, and I still can't bring myself to say conventions. When I first got here, I was told pretty much point blank, we do not have conventions at the Greenbrier. We have conferences at the Greenbrier, you know. So still hard for me to say that C word. Anyway, and so that was kind of like a whole new business, you know. And so groups in New York, they would charter trains and come down here. And that was another motivating factor for just doubling the size. So it goes from 250 to 500 rooms in this major expansion in the 1930s. And that's really sort of the Greenbrier that you see today when you drive up the front facade.
So along those lines, when you kind of look at the footprint of what it is today, what was added at that point?
Well, the whole north wing, so everything, you know, you go out when you walk down towards the golf club. And then the dining room, you know, it was sure nice to come here and have breakfast in the morning, walk into the dining room. So where you walk into the dining room, you know, where they greet you there, that was the end of the building. So they extended both the north and the south end. And so this wasn't here. I mean, the building would have ended kind of right outside those doors there. And everything from here this way has been added since the 50s.
So if any event that didn't happen at the Greenbrier changed the Greenbrier more than anything else, it has to be Pearl Harbor, right?
Yeah, really, you know. So here you had this luxury resort, and always very much connected to Washington. Again, because, you know, you still do it. You get on the train here, get off at the Union Station right across from the Capitol building. And so when Pearl Harbor happens, and you know, all of a sudden we're at war, one of the problems that the State Department faced is, you know, there were still fully functioning German, Japanese, Italian embassies in downtown Washington, D.C. And these folks were quickly declared enemy alien diplomats, was kind of the official word. And FDR, President Roosevelt, for security reasons, wanted them out of Washington. Oh, and the other important thing is there were Americans overseas. So there were Americans in Berlin and Tokyo and Rome. So they had to work out exchanges. Remember, these were diplomats, so they live in a different world than you and I. They're special treatment. And the highest priority from the State Department's point of view was to somehow ensure the good treatment of Americans overseas. So they wanted to make a point that the foreign diplomats were treated well here in the States. So on December 17th, 1941, the phone rings, and the general manager here, it's the State Department, and you know, we want to use your hotel temporarily to house these diplomats. And I don't think anybody quite knew what temporarily meant at that point. So it was December 17th, and 48 hours later, the train started pulling up here. So then the way it worked was the Germans and Italians were here, and then the Japanese were over at the homestead in Hot Springs. It had the same, you know, it's accessible by train, first class accommodations, and again, so both hotels kind of entered this unknown period, but the instructions were treat these as regular guests.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I always felt like that was such a strange time for the staff here, because in the meantime, the country's putting out propaganda that how evil these people are, and
Right.
you're being instructed to treat them
Right.
like you've treated guests for forever. So that had to be kind of strange for the staff.
Well, remember, the Japanese were more evil than the Germans. Right after Pearl Harbor, this did raise a lot of eyebrows, and I've heard stories that when the trains pulled up in Hot Springs, the diplomats were not warmly greeted, shall we say, and that certainly raised more eyebrows than I think the Germans and Italians being here.
Well, what was their life like here during that time for the diplomats? What was their day-to-day like?
Well, first of all, it's this time of year, so it's cold outside, and so they were pretty much in the hotel, and they did, you know, the golf courses weren't open. In fact, they weren't. Even as it's dragged on to spring, they didn't open the golf courses. There's a wonderful book called In Splendid Prisons that came out 2 years ago. Remember Harvey Solomon, who I talked to the other day. I sort of lost touch with him. And so he wrote this whole book called In Splendid Prisons about this episode. And you know, people were kind of going store crazy, I think. You know, you can imagine January, February, March, too chilly to go outside. I think they did a lot of shopping. That's the story I've heard. They did a lot of shopping because they also knew that when they got back to Germany and Italy, they were not going to have the availability of goods that they had here.
Well,
I have a question.
Go ahead.
The Germans weren't kept here in the hotel, right?
The Germans what?
They weren't kept here in the hotel?
The Germans, well, we took a beautiful drive in the countryside around here, and there are these magnificent barns that we were told were built by the Germans who were prisoners of war here during that time. Where did they stay?
They stayed in the hotel.
In the hotel?
But there were the POW.
Oh, that's a separate story. Yeah, right, yeah. People get this confused all the time.
so
What I'm talking about now.
when they brought those diplomats in, were guests kicked out of the hotel?
Right, yeah, oh yeah. Right. Well, there weren't very many.
Okay.
I think I met one person who was here on December 7th, 1941. And, you know, really, there was just a handful of people in the hotel. And I remember this person saying that right up here in the upper lobby, they put a radio on and everybody gathered around, you know, hearing this incredible news about how Pearl Harbor had been attacked, you know. So yeah, well, in the next couple of days, but there was no Christmas like there is today. I mean, nothing like today's Christmas. So I think whoever was here was asked to leave, and, you know, and the diplomats didn't arrive for 10 days later. So out they went. So yeah, and as far as this, I know they didn't use the cottages. Okay. So and their families. That's the other thing, you know. So we're talking hundreds of people who came here. So it was the diplomats, their spouses, their children. Over the years, I met quite a few of the children. I didn't meet many grown-ups, you know, because by the time I got here in the late 70s, it had been, you know, almost 40 years. And all the children, incidentally, they all remember the indoor swimming pool. That was like, man, this was like the greatest thing in the world, you know. They could go swimming every day, and as long as they wanted, you know, they all had. And then the other, I met one woman who was maybe 18 or 19, and her main memory was they changed the sheets every day. You know, I think food service remained pretty much the same. In fact, I think they even exchanged menus to where the American diplomats in Germany went down to Bad Nauheim, spa in Munich. Yep.
Thank you.
Atta girl, you just read my mind. Oh my gosh. But remember, there had been rationing in Germany for 2 years.
Right.
And so, in fact, our hotel had closed. They had to find the general manager and reopen the hotel. So they didn't exactly eat. Maybe you know the very famous diplomat George Kennan that wrote in very important in the Cold War years. So he was a young man at the State Department at that point. And he said, yeah, they all lost a lot of weight. I mean, they weren't mistreated, but it was nothing on this scale. And then the Japanese, there was a compound in Tokyo, so they just stayed in the compound. They didn't go to a hotel. They would have seen Jimmy Doolittle's airplanes fly over to bomb Tokyo in early 1942. And then I think the Italians stayed in, again, there was a small compound in Rome. So yeah, they well, who could be treated like the Greenbrier, but yeah, it wasn't quite on this scale.
So what was the POW story?
Well, so this whole episode that we're talking about with the diplomats being here stretched out longer than anticipated. So it wasn't until July of 42 that the last diplomats left. And in that period, both the Army and the Navy were looking at the Greenbrier and saying, maybe we can put this to wartime use. And the Army wanted it for a hospital. The Navy had some kind of funny plan where it was going to be like an R&R center for officers when they came back to the States. And I think they wanted the hotel to stay open, and they only wanted maybe half of the rooms. Anyway, they convened a board up, and as usual, the Army and the Navy were squabbling. It was a normal situation. And they convened a board in Washington and decided that the Army needed a hospital more than the Navy needed their facility. So if the last diplomat was out of here in mid-July of 42, within 6 weeks, the Army moved in, bought the Greenbrier, and that's how it becomes Ashford General Hospital. As part of that, they built a prisoner of war camp. So just down the road, you know, if you go out the gate and go right to where the sporting club golf course is, that's where the airport was landed. There had been a landing strip there since 1930. That was part of the expansion in 1930, was to add a landing strip where the sporting club, the Sneed golf course is today. That's where they built a prisoner of war camp. Now, so those, as opposed to diplomats that we were just talking about, these are captured German soldiers. So if you follow World War II, the first major battle was in North Africa, and the British are coming from the east. They're pushing Rommel's Africa Corps this way, and Eisenhower and the Americans land in the west, and they're kind of pushing the Germans. And finally, they kind of trap them in a peninsula in Tunisia. And literally, the German army has their back against the Mediterranean Sea, and they surrender. 250,000 German soldiers surrendered on one day. What the hell are we going to do with 250,000 soldiers? And that's what drives this whole idea of building prisoner of war. And the British say, we're just a little island. You know, we can't take these guys. Plus, even then, they were starting to build up for D-Day. And so that's how this program started to build prisoner of war. And actually, this is one of those sort of unknown stories of World War II. There were something like 500 prisoners of war camp in the United States. There were like 350,000, by the end of the war, 350,000 German POWs on American property. And what they did was put the POW camps near military facilities. So the reason they put it here is because they could use, there were 1,000 POWs in this camp over here, and they worked around here. That's part of the way the Army could afford to maintain not only this hotel, but all the facilities here during the Second World War.
And as you mentioned, like those facilities can be found all over the county. Some of those old structures still exist
So
throughout
what
the
happened
county.
after the war, they built like Quonset. So it was pretty basic over there. They were. I've seen pictures of these Quonset huts. There was nothing fancy about the POW. Yeah, people have this idea that they were officers and they were in the hotel. No. They were just. And I had met a few of those guys who had been prisoners of war over the years. Then I met their children, then I met their grandchildren.
I heard they actually got paid for building those barns, too.
When did they what?
They got paid for building those facilities?
Yeah, they got paid for, and actually, this one guy I met was really sort of amazing. He came down from Toronto. I remember his wife called me and said, I want to bring my husband back to the hospital. He was there during the Second World War, and I met a lot of guys who were patients here. So I assumed she was talking about a former patient, but she wanted to surprise him, and so as we're talking, I realized, wait a minute, this guy wasn't a patient. This guy was one of these POWs, and so he came down, and he had learned English in high school or something. So he was fluent in English when they got here. So he was sort of an intermediary between the POWs and the guards. There were a whole bunch of guards all around the POW camp. And so he said they were hired out. Lots of people, particularly when you got to the fall and it was harvest around here. They were hired out to help harvest all the farms around here. In fact, a big major farm to the west of Lewisburg, Moorlunda, they built a lot of the outbuildings at Moorlunda. And apparently these are all very talented people. And one of the classic stories is Mrs. Eisenhower was here and her watch wouldn't work. And so there was a guy on the POW who knew how to fix watches. And sort of a funny idea, a German POW was fixing Mrs. Eisenhower's watch. So they would go out and they would, so they had an income and they would then pool their money. Another way, they resold cigarettes. So remember, cigarettes were like a currency in the Second World War. So the guys who kind of ran the camp would buy the cigarettes and then resell them. They'd buy them at, I think it was 7 cents, and resell them for 11 cents. And then they had a pool of money. They did things like build tennis courts over there. Because the other thing is, pretty much the same people were there the whole time. So these people captured in North Africa and stayed there. There were very few changes coming and going. So I think everybody got to know one another. Everybody, really, I don't think there was much. I think there was one instance of somebody trying to escape. And what were we going to do? Where were we going to escape to? The only hope would be to get on a train and get somewhere. So.
How many were actually here, Bob? How many were actually here? How many POWs?
How many POWs? About 1,000. And I met one guy who was brought here, who was wounded after D-Day, so he didn't seem to be part of that group. So these people, they all would have known each other from the units that were in the German army. And apparently they were great workers, Incidentally, before the German POWs there was a group of Italian, and I don't exactly understand why this happened. The Italians came here, they captured North Africa, and they were only here for a couple of months. And for some reason they were moved somewhere else, and then the Germans were brought in here. But I can remember some of the local farmers, and they liked to come work in their fields because they would sing while they worked, you know. And so I don't know, maybe some of you remember Tom Buskirk. He ran the gun club here for years. They had a big farm up Route 92, and he said his mother would come out and they had to sit in a chair, and all these Italians would, you know, work in the fields, and they'd sing, and apparently everybody just got along just fine. And I don't really understand why those Italians got moved. There was another camp here in West Virginia, and then all these Germans came in a little bit later.
So going back to the Ashford, as an Army football fan, I'm going to say Army won again, and they built the Army hospital.
Yeah.
But at that point, we kind of talked about it yesterday. Some people thought that could be the end of the Greenbrier when the Army took
Right.
over.
I mean, again, I think we were talking about that menu yesterday, and you know, I almost kind of choke up when I look at that menu from the last day that the Greenbrier was open. You could sort of imagine, you know, these folks raising their glass, and there were some articles in local newspapers about this very sentimental, you know, Old Lang Syne, you know, where the Army's coming in. You know, nobody had any idea in August of 1942 how the war, how long it was going to last, what things. So, so as I said, the Army owned it, and you know, and theoretically, you know, they could have kept it afterwards. That's a funny idea, you know. It could have turned into some sort of giant VA hospital after the war.
But okay, so after they buy it, start to convert it to a hospital, what has to happen in order for it to be converted to a hospital? Obviously, there was some construction that had to take place in order to make it functional.
Yeah, one of the big problems was the elevator situation. Yeah, the elevators, were, if you can imagine, gurneys and wheelchairs, it can be a little slow today going up and down on these elevators. You know, can you imagine a 2,000 bed hospital? So this was a 500-room hotel, and it was 2,000 beds. So even a historian can figure out that's 4 beds per room. You know, they were packed in here, and it was a major surgical center. They did vascular surgery and neurosurgery; those were kind of the specialties. And the surgeries went on up on the 5th floor because they got a lot of natural sunlight up there. And oh yeah, we're getting very far. Yeah, that's right. And so one of the first things they did was add an elevator shaft right outside the Cameo Ballroom. If you were there last night, or you can go through the Cameo, the windows facing the front of the hotel. Apparently, where those archways are, you could go in there. There were like 3 cars that went up and down to the operating rooms, and that's how they got all the equipment up and down. And then the other issue was water. There were just a lot more people flushing the toilets here. You know, 2,000 people. This is the time when the Greenbrier would have been pretty much full with 800 or 900 people, so there were just a lot more people, a lot of water. So one of the great assets of the Greenbrier is that the Greenbrier has owned its own water supply since the Greenbrier opened in 1913. So about 10 miles north up in a place called Alvon is where the water was piped under. So they really had to upgrade that whole water system. So I think the water and the elevator were 2 of the major issues to convert. And then as soon as the war was over, they tore that elevator shaft down.
As you can see in some of the pictures up here, we talked about how much the diplomats enjoyed the pool and some things to do around here. Obviously, the golf courses, the pool, all the activities of the Greenbrier served an important purpose as a hospital as well.
Right. Because this was also sort of a rehabilitation center. So the idea, in a lot of cases, these soldiers had been to hospitals before they came here. Sometimes people sort of imagine the guy's wounded and he ends up here. Well, they went to a field hospital. They may have gone to a hospital in England, and then from there they were sent. So you came to Ashford General if you needed vascular or neurosurgery. That brought you here. But the other thing was, as one guy said, when you got here, they said, "This is your last hospital, son. So you're going to stay here until you're ready to either go back on active service or be discharged." You know. So that's another thing that made this a great hospital. You know, they had golf courses. The swimming pool was actively used. The tennis courts were actively used. Yeah, you see the guys there on the top signing in for golf.
Yeah, I think if I was going to be in a hospital, Dr. Bob, this is where I'd want to be.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah. And really one of the, you know, my father was in an army hospital in the Second World War. He was wounded in the Pacific Theater and spent a lot of time in a hospital in Hawaii. So I always had a sort of soft spot in my heart for this whole story. And really one of the great privileges of my job here over the years was meeting. Because back in the 70s and 80s, I pretty frequently met people who had been patients here. And what always struck me was how the former patient usually was almost sort of dragged here by their family. The former patient, the former GI, apparently had talked, "Oh man, I was in this incredible army hospital back during the Second World War." And they would say, "Well, Dad, let's go there." "Well, no, I don't want to." Because, you know, it's sort of a bittersweet memory.
Right.
I mean, people left in better shape than when they arrived, but still, it was a hospital, and there were some pretty banged up people here. And so, almost to a man, they were reluctant to come back, but they were thrilled once they got here.
Right. And then the picture on the bottom corner here, this slide, I kind of think that tells a story. If you're wondering, why are we talking about all this? I thought we were talking about the bunker. That picture at the bottom starts to tie it together right there. Is Eisenhower visiting Ashford General, which he did a couple of times, right?
Yeah, he's down at the clubhouse there. Eisenhower was here. You know, interestingly enough, Eisenhower was overseas for 3 years, and during the war he only came home once. And actually it was about this time of year in 1944. And you know, I once met Eisenhower's granddaughter. She was here, and we were talking about this, and she said, "Yeah, that was sort of a secret. They didn't want the Germans to know that Eisenhower wasn't, you know, right there in Europe." And he came back really to meet with President Roosevelt, and that's the point, because one of those World War II, who was going to lead the D-Day invasion? Was it going to be Eisenhower, or was it going to be George Marshall, the chief of staff? And so they had decided it was going to be Eisenhower. And so he was going to meet with the president and with George Marshall, and it's just January of '44 to plan the D-Day invasion in June. And to visit with his wife. So he and Mamie came down here in January of 1944. They stayed in Top Notch Cottage, so right outside, behind the hotel, is Top Notch, which is kind of off by itself. So it was nice. It wasn't particularly elaborate, but it offered privacy. And incidentally, that was George Marshall's cottage. George Marshall was the great organizer. He was the chief of staff. And apparently he came here pretty frequently and stayed in Top Notch too. So there was that visit. The sort of the famous visit, when that picture was taken, was after the end of the war. So Eisenhower comes back. In fact, we have some telegrams, you know, that he's about to come home, and you know, Mamie wants to spend time at Ashford General. And so, you know, they were here for about a couple of weeks. And that was an extended visit. You know, he could play a little golf, and it was sort of R&R, and that was in the summer of '44. So the war in Europe had ended. So those were two kind of R&R. And then he actually had some pneumonia, and when he was treated here. What we're driving at here is that some pretty influential people, particularly George Marshall and General Eisenhower, knew the Greenbrier, and like we were saying yesterday, we can't help but think, if these are military guys, and when they're looking at this place, they're thinking, this somehow could be usable. You know, there's a rail line that goes right to Washington, D.C. across the street. You know, you got this hotel. It's far away from the coastal areas. So by the end of the Second World War, with the development of the B-29, you know, they can envision German bombers coming all the way and bombing the U.S. So, you know, I'm kind of speculating here, but it would have been their nature to look and think, this could be some sort of backup position here, I suppose.
Yeah, and at the time, they owned it, so they
Yeah,
had to be
right, they owned it, right, yeah. And so, you know, I always thought that's a really important reason why the bunker was put here, because you know, they'd been eyeing it for some time, and it had a lot of natural attributes. And again, when you're talking about, you know, in the 50s, when they were talking about this continuity of government program, they were still assuming bombers, and there are all sorts of coastal defenses. So if a bomber could A, get here, B, get past the coastal defenses, and then get this far inland, and then they were protected by the mountains. It's a pretty tough target here.
So the war ends, and luckily enough, the Army did not hold on to the Greenbrier. The CNO was able to purchase it back, and that's where Dorothy Draper starts to come into the picture.
Yeah. And incidentally, just to pick up on the POW, one of the reasons the Army sold it back to the railroad was the POWs left. And so then the issue was, can we maintain not only this hotel and the facilities, but 7,000 acres, and you know, it just seemed too much, and that's why they went back to the railroad and said, hey, you know, you guys want it back.
So they do get it back, and they hired Dorothy Draper to redecorate everything, and in 1948 it reopens with the ball that most of you celebrated last night.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Well, yeah, we could celebrate that over and over and over. Yeah. That was one of the great events of Greenbrier history. You know, the building had taken a beating. Just, again, the sheer number of people who were in this building during the Second World War, you know, I think it was in pretty sad shape there. And so, you know, having Dorothy Draper come in and do all the decorating and some structural changes was a necessity, just from the hard days of the Second World War. And so we're up and running again by April of 1948.
And quickly it starts to thrive again, and it's a go-to place. And then the Cold War sort of begins. So take us through what was the Cold War? How did all that sort of develop?
You know, I think it's interesting as we go along here, how the Cold War is sifting into memory, you know. I've been talking to my son recently, and I saying really one of the most important events was the end of the Cold War. And it's getting to be hard today to people to remember how the Cold War, this rivalry between the democracy of the United States versus the communist system in Russia, permeated everything, you know. All foreign policy decisions were sort of seen through the lens of the Cold War. So the World War II ends, and the kind of the two standing powers are the United States and Russia. Incidentally, I'm always amazed. Russia sustained incredible losses. The casualties in Russia were just unbelievable. And yet, you know, they were still a threat. Remember, I mean, by its definition, communism was an international. I mean, the whole idea was the international workers would unite, right? And so it was very expansionistic, and so the whole idea of the U.S. strategy was to contain. The containment policy that this guy George Kennan and I was talking about earlier sort of defined, contain communism in Russia where it is. And I don't know, I guess if you're going to start, when did the Cold War start? Remember, because we were allies during the Second World War.
Right.
But maybe the Berlin airlift in 1948 when, you know, the Russians wanted to take over their section of Germany, and we airlifted into Berlin. That was in 1948. And really for the next 40 years, you know, I've often thought, it's an example of how pervasive the Cold War was. That something as totally unlikely and improbable as the Greenbrier, this luxury resort with Dorothy Draper decor and Sam Snead as the golf pro, you know, was for 30 years an integral part of the American defense system.
Right.
That's how in such detail, the Cold War spread into all aspects of society.
And during that time, it's sort of a nation living in fear. A lot of people are building bunkers. I know if you go on a bunker tour, Deanna has the duck and cover videos that were shown. But it really is a lot of propaganda out there. A lot of the people are scared and trying to find.
Right, and then you throw in the atomic weapons, and then the hydrogen bomb. You know, and so you know we detonate the atomic bomb. Pretty soon they have it, the Russians have it, and then we increase things with the hydrogen bomb, and pretty soon they have it. So yeah, I mean, you know, I remember somebody saying about the bunker, you know, when they built it, they weren't thinking if this is going to happen, they were thinking when it's going to happen. I mean, we were particularly there in the 50s, I think. 50s and 60s, it sort of peaked in the early 60s, this whole bomb scare. I'm actually sort of old enough to remember that.
What is that on the Life magazine up there?
What was that on the what?
The Life magazine.
Life
Oh.
magazine. It's a Life magazine talking about just that, the drive to build mass shelters around the country.
Oh yeah, the Life magazine cover.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you know, to build some sort of effective civil defense system for the whole country there was actually a famous report done in the late 50s, maybe the Gaither report it was called. If we were going to protect the American population with fallouts, it would have taken literally the whole budget. So all sorts of ideas were floated, and you remember those signs, fallout shelters, and all sorts of buildings would have been converted into fallout shelters. But you know, to provide total fallout would have just been
I didn't know how the basement of my grade school was going to protect me.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's right. Happy birthday. You're 75. You remember all this, right? Yeah, that's right.
Thanks,
Say happy birthday.
Absolutely, happy birthday.